I'm happy to serve as chair of this panel, which is on grassroots organizing. Today there are 3 speakers, and I'm going to introduce them all at once. First is Terrence Johnson, who will be speaking on African American civil rights and educational equality organizing in South Carolina. Terence is a history teacher at Montgomery College in Silver Spring, Maryland. He has conducted research on rare letters and photographs of African American educators dating from the 1940s to the 1970s. He is presently working on an audio book that explores the secret history of the civil rights movement. The next speaker is Stephen McNeil. You want to raise your hand? So Stephen has worked for the San Francisco office of the AFSC for 32 years in a variety of positions. Currently, he is the Wage Peace Director working on police militarization, U.S.-Mexico arms trade, and supporting veterans and active duty military personnel through the GI Rights Hotline, which is housed in the AFSC San Francisco office. Stephen was a member of the San Francisco LGBT Rights Task Force, and he has been active with FCNL for 3 decades and is currently on its general committee and the board of Pendle Hill. And our final speaker is Francis Bonenfant-Juwong. Is that pretty good? Okay. Who will be talking about Catalyst Agents, community development, and the organizing of Arab villages for peace and prosperity in the 1950s. Francis is a PhD candidate in history and peace studies at the Kroc Institute of the University of Notre Dame. His dissertation incorporates the work of AFSC into a larger discussion of the role of American NGOs in the promotion of development as peace building among Arab villagers in the mid-20th century. Without further ado, Terence, you're on. Thank you.
The title of my paper is The Intersection Between Civil Rights Organizations in South Carolina and the Support of the American Friends Service Committee. And for me, this is interesting because I sort of stumbled into the situation by accident. I did a little oral history when I was in South Carolina, and I talked to some of the people who were like the sort of like the last of a lot of the civil rights people associated with civil rights, particularly civil rights as it pertains to teachers, particularly African American teachers. And so I basically found a lot of documents by accident. I was interested in the history of teachers and what they did. How did, my big question was, how did African American teachers survive in the wake of desegregation? And I think that was an area that, and I still think it's something that's not been studied very well, even today. And I was lucky because in South Carolina is a very interesting place, particularly Columbia. People, I mean, it's really like, it sounds stereotypical, but I found it to be true, where, people will actually, not knowing you, actually take you in as family and say, come on over. And so I had an elderly woman about 90 years old by the name of Mary Solomon, asked me to come over and because I was looking for evidence of teacher rights. And she said, well, my husband used to work for this organization called the Palmetto Education Association. He's passed away, but he put some stuff in the garage, and I don't know if it's even there. And so I went in, and I said, well, it's locked. Where's the key? She said, I lost the key. And she said, why don't you can break into it if you like. So I got my crowbar and I broke into it, and guess what I found? I found all kinds of incredible, which unfortunately I didn't really have time to prepare photographs, and maybe in the future I will have photographs prepared. But I found all kinds of incredible things that this organization was doing, and how it also was interacting with other organizations, both black and white organizations. For example, I found a letter that wrote of Richard Nixon writing, I think he was vice president during the time, he wrote to Walker Solomon, commending him for all of his work in the federal government, And I found an early picture of Reverend Jesse Jackson. I think he was only about maybe 15 years old, standing as a future teacher of America, because he had an organization called the Future Teachers of America, and he was in that group. And he was, I can tell you, he was much more statuesque than the other students who were standing beside him. Okay, and so I was finding the roots of civil rights leaders who were young. I even found let's see, did I find a picture? Yeah, I found a picture of the guy who's now part of the, he's the leader of NASA, Mr. Bolden, Charles Bolden. He was also, he's from South Carolina, and I got to meet the guy, okay? But so I found this material, with all of this material, but then I found letters about the American Friends. And I didn't know about the American Friends organization. And I said, well, who are these people? And so I kept the letters, and at some point, because I didn't do anything with it for years, I just had the letters, a few of the letters, and then gradually I began the process of trying to figure out who are these people, where are they? And so I found the phone number in some of the records, and I said, oh, those people don't exist anymore, right? That was such a long time ago. And so, but I said, oh, let me just call. And I called the number. They were there, right? And I talked to your local archivist here, and I was able to get a lot of information to help piece together our history. And it's not a total record. I'm not finished. I'm still on a journey, I feel, because there's so much about the American Friends Service Committee that I don't know about, and there's so much also in terms of how some of their contributions in the state of South Carolina. So I will present to you just some of the things that we're going to give you a context for the history of the civil rights movement in South Carolina. One of the things I'll argue is that South Carolina is the center. A lot of historians are going to say, no, this is not true, but I'm going to argue this point, is the center of the modern civil rights movement. Now, a lot of people say, what? No, it didn't happen there. Well, I can tell you that Brown versus Board of Education, well, the basis of Brown versus the Board of Education is Briggs versus Elliott, and that happened in South Carolina. That was the case that basically started with African-American adults wanting their children to have buses to get to school. That's what it was about. And it went from, why don't we go further than that? Not just buses, but why don't we let's go with desegregation. So eventually, this is what happens. It gets on the docket with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and the rest is history. Now, one of the things that's going to happen as a result of that is that there's going to be a white backlash on African Americans in South Carolina. And the leaders, the African-American leaders, and many of them are ministers, farmers, and teachers. African-American ministers, farmers, and teachers. And so what they do secretly is they are organizing themselves. What are we going to do when they start firing many of our people? What are they going to do? What are we going to do when they start telling them that you have to pay your mortgage tomorrow or next week? What are we going to do when they start firing teachers as desegregation? Because desegregation, we know it's coming. We got Brown versus Board of Education, but it's coming. And so what are we going to do? So they start organizing themselves, and as a result of this, they start looking at how are we going to have money for court cases. We know some court cases are probably going to come. What are we going to do for farmers who need their mortgages paid? What are we going to do for African Americans who own businesses? And so one of the things that they start doing is that they start organizing under what would be called, history will call it the Orangeburg Freedom Movement. This is an early movement in the 1950s. And one of the things that they start is they start a petition to desegregate the schools. And then there's something called the White Citizen Council that's grown up all over the South. And these are whites who have organized themselves to oppose any desegregation. And so what they do is they start firing African Americans who are working in their stores. They start firing African American teachers. They also start intimidating African American farmers to try to get them off their land. To say, oh, if you sign a petition, we're gonna fire you. It got so bad in South Carolina that if you were, say, a teacher, and maybe you didn't even sign a petition, But let's say your father-in-law signed the petition, then they would fire you. Okay? So it was a very serious situation. But they persevered. They did not stop. And one of the things I think that I was listening to the speaker earlier this morning, I thought about that, is that one of the things that they had that made them succeed is that they were a grassroots organization that had a vision. They had an idea of, if we're going to do this, what are the consequences, what are we going to have to do, and how long might we, in other words, do we agree to do it for a long time? Do we just do it for like a month? Do we do it for 6 months? Or do we say, this is on the long haul, we're going to do this if it takes 10, 20 years, we're going to be doing this? And they agreed, we're going to be doing it. We're going to have to do this for many, many years. My paper covers the years 1955 to 1957. And as I was telling someone in the audience earlier, the reason why I had to stop because I had so much material, I said, well, okay, it goes all the way up to the 1970s, so I can't do that. That'll be about 50, 60 pages. So I said, I want to keep it down as much, 20, 25 pages, right, of the movement. And there's several levels of the movement. So the petition starts where they sign the petition, but it also gets in the newspaper. So the names of these individuals are in the newspaper who signed, which means that the White Citizens Council can then look in the paper at the people that they know who they work for and say, John, you're working for me. Have your name taken off of it. Some African Americans do get their names taken off, but many keep their names on. And as a result, we have all of these people who face all kinds of problems. So for example, and I'll just read just a little bit, in Ellery, this is a town in Orangeburg County, many African Americans either voluntarily left their homes or were forced out by white landlords who advocated racial segregation. Burgess Butler and James Shivers, local residents of Ellery, had to vacate their homes with less than a week's notice. So that would be an example. And then you had banks, you had one African American bank, Victory Savings Bank, that was very important because this was a bank that basically provided aid to African Americans who needed to pay their mortgages, needed to pay their bills. And one of the things that the American Friends Service Organization did is that it gave money to the bank. It invested money into the bank so that the bank could make these loans. Okay, and I thought this was very interesting because, you know, when I studied the civil rights movement, I never heard of that. I just heard, you know, people marched, and then as a result, we shall overcome, that was it. But behind the scenes, the American Friends Organization was doing its work. Okay, and I even asked Don Davis, why don't you advertise this? You know, he said, well, yeah, we don't have a lot of money, blah, blah, and I understand that, okay? So that was the issue with, and there were lots of these cases, and I'm not going to read all of them. You can read this if it ever gets published. There was also issues facing teachers. And here again, I think one of the conditions that I learned about was the fact that the American Friends, they were much more successful if there's a grassroots organization already in place. So they don't have to go somewhere and try to build something. It's already there. Okay, and so the Palmetto Education Association was a teacher organization that had been working for many decades before the American Friends entered South Carolina. They had already been doing this stuff, but what they were doing is that they were always looking, because they needed money, so they were always looking for organizations that could contribute not only money, but also logistic information about the law, because they were very heavily involved in trying to win court cases. And so there was a famous Ellery case in 1956 where teachers were fired because they did not want to sign an oath of allegiance. They had to sign an oath of allegiance at this school to maintain their jobs. So they had to say, you know, I'm not a member of the NAACP, because the NAACP in South Carolina and many parts of the South was considered, believe it or not, a radical organization. Okay? They had radical ideas, and even associated with being communists. So what happened is that the AFSC created the Rights of Conscience branch, and what they were able to do is that a lot of my research showed is that they were careful in giving money to people and to organizations, because what they were doing is they were networking. And so what I found was a lot of networking with the Palmetto Education Association and the Rights of Conscience under the American Friends. And so there was this gentleman, and you all probably know his name. He was over the Rights of Conscience for a while, Fred Fuchs. One of the things that he did was he would contact other organizations and ask and tell them what the plight of African American teachers in the case of Ellery was, and in other situations in South Carolina. And so one of the things that he was able to get them to do is he got some people who were wealthy, affluent, to invest money into the bank, the Victory Savings Bank. Also, let's send clothes. So I have records of sending clothes, sending shoes, sending dresses, okay, sending food. So the American Friends were doing all of these sorts of things. And they also were they contacted a man by the name of, you probably heard of him, Thurgood Marshall. So Thurgood Marshall got involved as well. They contacted NAACP national leaders. They got involved as well. Bayard Rustin, he got involved as well. Fannie Lou Hamer, she got involved as well. And they were pushing the Rights of Conscience to give more support. At first, Fred Fuchs said, well, we don't have a lot of money right now. We can kind of get other people. But these civil rights leaders were able to convince Fred Fuchs, okay, and then they started giving money. And one of the good results of this was that, I have, letters from the African Americans who were teachers, thanking, the American Friends for all the help that they could get. Because, a lot of these people would have been homeless without that. Their bills were being paid by the American Friends and other organizations, because if the American Friends had not paid, or if they paid, then they would have other organizations who would also do this sort of thing. And so this, to me, and I'm going to, 5 minutes, I'll be on time, was very interesting, because one of the things that's going to result from this sort of support from the American Friends is that this movement is kept alive. People are going to be able to continue the struggle. So you started off with a grassroots struggle that involves petitioning. But that's going to be something, it's not going to stay in petitioning, it's going to also now be involved with nonviolent civil disobedience. And so Orangeburg, South Carolina is going to be a very important centerpiece for ministers and teachers and college students who are going to, do things very simply as quietly walk down the street and pray. You'll have things like that. Stand in front of Woolworths and Sears with their signs. And they're able to do that because they have the financial backing of these black and white organizations. And like I said, the American Friends Service Committee was critical in the success of this early civil rights movement in South Carolina. And so that's all I have to say for now. Thank you.
My talk and my paper focuses on LGBT rights in the American Friends Service Committee, a staff concern. I titled that because it really came up from staff joined by committee members and eventually board members in terms of promoting the rights of LGBTQ people. Probably the most famous openly gay person hired by the service committee was Bayard Rustin, who was on assignment with AFSC in Pasadena in 1953 when he was arrested on a morals charge. The service committee continued to deploy him, like George Blakey, around the country because Bayard Rustin, as an African-American Quaker nonviolent trainer, was extremely effective. But when he was part of the working party on Speak Truth to Power, which was mentioned earlier, the paper that addressed nonviolent alternatives to the Cold War, he asked that his name be removed from the publication because of the morals charge that might have impeded its acceptance in the United States. The board of directors of AFSC in 2012, on the 100th anniversary of Bayard's birth, restored his name to the document. In the 1960s in San Francisco, the Managing Society worked with the local criminal justice staff person, Jan Marinason, whose vision of criminal justice was to decriminalize acts, social behavior acts, as widely as possible in order to keep people out of the criminal justice system. So prostitution, drugs, and social deviance were groups that he worked with in the 60s. In 1961, he had Don Luce of the Managing Society address the Bay Area Criminal Justice Clearinghouse on the status of the male homosexual and criminal justice. And in the 1960s, the Council on Religion and the Homosexual, which was a sort of a faith group along with gay and lesbians such as Phyllis and Del Martin, joined together in order to get rid of the San Francisco Vice Squad, which was the most pernicious instrument of oppression in San Francisco anyway. So we housed the Council on Religion and the Homosexual within AFSC property, and we're active on that group, which published in 1965 a brief of injustice. That was very important in bringing to the attention of the wider public the fact that criminalizing homosexual activities was really not the way to go. The earlier, George Blakey, who was one of the original signers of the AFSC staff committee letter that went out to the wider AFSC family in 1975, talked about his own experiences as being deployed by AFSC at a time when the open letter brought him on invitations to speak. The letter originally had 4 signers, and then there were 18 signers, and by the end in 1976, there were 250 signers on the letter. And this was at a time when 36 states criminalized homosexual behavior, and so it was a brave thing for these people to do. In the letter, they wrote, "We believe the Service Committee in its programs and its interpersonal relationships should express that love and sensitivity referred to in the publication Toward a Quaker View of Sex," which was a British Quaker publication. Quote, "Now more aware of the socially inflicted suffering of people who love others of the same sex, we affirm the power and joy of non-exploitative, loving relationships. As a society and as individuals, we oppose arbitrary social, economic, and legal abridgments of the right to share this love." So from the beginning, this staff letter reflected the spiritual basis of this work. And if this is something that continued throughout the time that AFSC was very, very active on LGBT rights. In '76, the board of directors had a longer statement. Our statements from AFSC are often very long. But the beginning really sums it up, because this was not a uncontroversial step to become involved in working with grassroots LGBT communities in asserting their rights. The board of directors minuted, "The AFSC board of directors supports the civil and human rights of homosexual and bisexual persons and commits itself to implement this concern." So how do they go about implementing this concern? There were internal ways, internal changes within the service committee. There were challenges to the service committee and within the service committee. And then there was an external witness, which has gone on for over 40 years. Some of the internal changes are the fact that in 1979, the affirmative action plan of AFSC began to include lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. Eventually, gender identity and transgender was added to that over the years. Internally, in 1987, AFSC became one of the first U.S. nonprofits to offer domestic partners coverage to its staff. And in 2003, the health plan included, in a limited way, transgender health benefits, mainly surgical. Does not, even to this day, cover medical coverage in terms of drugs. The Service Committee then published in 2005 a document called Effective Advocacy for Transgender Inclusive Employee Health Benefits Plans, a very nice document that was shared with other non-profit groups who are struggling with the issue of whether or not they should cover transgender health care. Internally, the Service Committee periodically did surveys or questionnaires on sexual orientation issues in 1991, 97, and 2016. Another strategy that was really pivotal in terms of promoting programmatic work within the Service Committee were face-to-face consultations of committee, board, volunteer, and staff that were held. There were 6 of them starting in 1979, and the last one was in 2008. And they were really important in bringing together people from the grassroots community along with staff and board and committee members active on the issues. The challenges on this work really came externally from the Religious Society of Friends, who are not monolithic in their approach to any issue, and some people feel that, in particular, the attack on the affirmative action plan of AFSC, which included people of color and women, as well as LGBT and people with disabilities, that the concern over the affirmative action plan was one of ownership, whether or not Quakers would continue to really own and control and be involved in the Service Committee. And in particular, it was easier to attack the adding on of LGBT people in the affirmative action plan than it was to be public about their concern about people of color and women. And so there were several consultations and efforts by the Service Committee to struggle with this issue, which goes on today. The 2009 financial crisis really led to the diminishment of LGBT programming within the Service Committee. At that time, over 40% of the staff were cut, and the LGBT programs, which were very, very big and active in Seattle, Portland, Michigan, and Hawaii, basically started to drop off the map. In 2010, the Seattle program was the last AFSC program to survive. The external witness of AFSC in this area, as I read the board minute, was a series of board statements. One, a statement of concern about sexual and gender identity, which led to gender identity being added to the AA plan. 1994, treasuring of all members of the human community, an AFSC statement on the civil rights of LGBT and all people. And in 2004, the board came out with a good minute on civil marriage. The other strategy that AFSC deployed in this area as well as other areas is signing on to briefs, friend of the court briefs, amicus briefs. And so there were 7 of them related to LGBT civil rights issues. And this was an important addition because having faith groups sign on to some of these civil rights cases showed a wider community support than grassroots LGBT groups could muster. We also, in various parts of the country, opposed anti-LGBT ballot initiatives, some successfully, some not, but they were very active local campaigns, grassroots campaigns around the country in that area. And the big area that we found a niche was we supported LGBT youth. We created what was called the Bridges Project, starting with a publication, Bridges of Respect, which was used in high schools and counselors around the country. It was translated and added on to in Spanish and was used in Latin America as well. The third area was building bridges between LGBT groups and religious spiritual communities. And so we helped found with the National Gay Lesbian Rights Task Force the National Religious Leadership Roundtable. The Michigan program had a Faith Action Network. The Portland program had one called the People of Faith Against Bigotry Coalition. The fourth area we worked in was build institutional capacity to serve LGBT communities. And so during the AIDS crisis, again, we had a panel at the General Executive Secretary level called the AIDS Task Force, and which created an AIDS statement that called for education, especially in communities of color and low-income communities around AIDS at an early point in the epidemic. The other area that we worked on sporadically was nonviolent direct action. And so I know our region, our nonviolent movement building, with David Hartzell worked with, had a trainers collective that included a lesbian Penn Garvin who worked with LGBT grassroots groups around the Supreme Court die-in sit-in in 1987 after the Kentucky sodomy case was upheld. And so that kind of direct action also is reflected in 1999. Our wonderful Kay Whitlock, who really started out with AFSC in the 1980 Conference on Lesbians and Gay Men Face the Law here in Philadelphia. She co-presented with the Reverend James Tinney from Howard University. She has been involved in and out of AFSC over the decades, but she joined with the Reverend Mel White in something called Soul Force, which was an attempt to actually address Reverend Falwell and people that were promoting anti-gay religious rhetoric. So 200, mostly pastors, some rabbis, and some Catholic religious gathered together over several days at the Thomas Road Baptist Church and talked with the Reverend Falwell and the supporters of that church to try and get a personal direct interaction and sort of a nonviolent but quiet interaction. And her description of this, which I wanted to read, was she talks about the 200 of them were at the service on the last day of the witness. The service at Thomas Road Baptist Church, this is in Virginia, was characterized by a much more moderate address by Reverend Falwell and by glorious music. We'd been asked to all sit together, but demurred. And so when Reverend Falwell graciously introduced the Soul Force delegation and asked us to stand, we rose from every part of the church, not in an undifferentiated clump, but in ones, twos, and threes. It was a wonderful moment. When it was over, we went many separate ways, some to lunches with newfound but unlikely friends, some to catch planes for home. That night, as my partner Phoebe and I were leaving a Lynchburg restaurant, we were warmly greeted by several members of the Thomas Road Baptist Church who recognized us. We expressed our gratitude for having had the opportunity to meet them and so many others. Will it always be this congenial? Not likely. So where are we going at this point? There is an active element of the Indonesia AFSC program that works with LGBT and transgender, transsexual communities, quietly as much as possible because the government is clamping down on that kind of activity. The original impetus for AFSC to get involved in this issue came not only from staff, but grassroots movements, the Gay Liberation Front, and other activist groups in Philadelphia and around the country. And Urvashi Vaid, who's a wonderful writer and speaker, has called her book that she published in 2012, trying to get back to the race and class analysis that the Gay Liberation Front had back in the 70s. She calls it the Irresistible Revolution, Confronting Race and Class and the Assumptions of the LGBT Politics. She talks about basically how we need to really, again, as Bayard Rustin said, address the whole issue of economics and class, and if we're ever going to achieve justice. The other area in which the Service Committee is currently active is on this whole immigration reform effort that affects LGBT international, transnational couples. And one of the principles in the AFSC's pathway to justice for immigration is Principle 6, make family reunification a top priority. Recognize the distinctly important and valuable role of family ties by supporting the reunification of immigrant families in a way that equally respects both heterosexual and same-gender relationships. The Service Committee is one of the few groups that holds up this value. Thank you.
This paper explores the AFSC's involvement in what by the 1950s had become called community development, a village-level approach to democratic and capitalist formation in the non-Western parts of the globe. Within its work among primarily Palestinian Arabs, the Service Committee adopted community development as an explicitly peace-building strategy within the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, although I will briefly touch on the related work in Jordan as well. So to give a flavor of what community development entailed, I offer an opening vignette. In 1959, the Service Committee's field director in Israel described the organization's efforts among Palestinian Arabs to an Israeli neighbor, mentioning how they sought to be quote-unquote catalytic agents, helping Arabs connect local needs in health, education, and agricultural techniques to available services. The neighbor replied, your organization is concerned with little things. This notion of outsiders acting as sort of stimulating agents, partnering with locals and governing authorities to promote changes in the little things, can be used as shorthand for the community development movement prominent in the 1950s among both private and public actors. So this paper builds on sort of recent waves of historical scholarship on both development and humanitarianism. But here today I center the work of the Service Committee and their approach to peace building within sort of development as humanitarianism. So although working with states was critical, the Service Committee's adoption of community development was oriented less toward formal diplomatic and political negotiations and more towards bottom-up efforts aimed at empowerment, people-to-people contact, relationship building, and achieving social and economic equality through small-scale gradual improvements in agricultural practices and ways of living. Relationship building was critical to community development, a means and an end, and the Service Committee gave it special emphasis. So just regarding structure for the paper, I first sort of very briefly provide some basic background. And then second, I then sort of explore the Service Committee's adoption of community development work in Israel and Arab villages in Jordan during Israel's first decade of existence. And finally, third, I sort of very tentatively assess the promise and limitations of sort of the Service Committee's community development. Just to sort of briefly summarize my conclusions, I suggest that community development is an eminently humane approach, emphasizing the curbing of conflict through relationship building within and across communities. However, there are perhaps limitations, and sort of the Service Committee's adherence to the community development approach seems to have precluded in some ways a more serious reckoning of Arab attitudes, especially toward the Israeli state, at least within sort of this 1950s period. So just by way of background, so formed in 1917, the AFSC's original purposes were to provide alternative war service for conscientious objectors while acting as a mechanism to heal Quaker schisms, but they also extended sort of a long-standing Quaker commitment to peace. And like other voluntary entities in the 1920s, transitioned a lot of their overseas work after World War I from relief to what was then called reconstruction. So looking beyond immediate physical needs, groups like the Service Committee sought to address the root causes of suffering and hatred, especially in the wake of war, and to thereby create circumstances in which peace would flourish among former enemies. The Service Committee also engaged in reconstruction work at home, as Guy Aiken talked about earlier, addressing poverty during the Great Depression in the US. And so these experiences in building community and promoting development sort of prefigured their adoption of community development in the Middle East. So before I move into the case itself, I just wanted to sort of outline in broad terms a little bit more what community development was. So from a community development perspective, the rural village was sort of the primary unit of analysis, and sort of daily life within the village was viewed holistically with integrated social and economic facets. So accordingly, community development projects involve sort of self-help and empowerment strategies at the village level that would holistically boost economic and social life while working within traditional institutions which were viewed as sort of shock absorbers for sort of the forces of modernity. So undergirding these beliefs were assumptions that development would be most sustainable and effective if locals bought into it, had a stake in its success, and took increasing responsibility for it. But practitioners like the Service Committee also assumed that the social and economic realms were connected. that village families would have difficulty boosting production or introducing new ways of living if they were constantly battling debt, hunger, and poor health. In other words, economic success ensured social improvement ensured economic success. So these concerns and assumptions produced a specific combination of mutually reinforcing practices, sort of technical assistance and community organizing. So sort of technical assistance, there's maybe the best way to explain it was someone said that technical assistance began when the person who invented the wheel told somebody about it. So it was a way of sharing knowledge. And so by introducing simple, inexpensive improvements that were sort of locally appropriate and adapted, technical assistance wouldn't of itself help boost production, income, and standards of living. So technical assistance is kind of the economic side. And so community organizing is more the social side. It was more directly aimed at social change through community building. So this included holistic programming that brought the community together, from health, diet, sanitation, to recreation, leisure, arts programming, all while trying to forge local village leadership that would inculcate democratic ways of living and self-governance. So bringing the two together, sort of the social and the economic, so the idea was to bring technical assistance would boost economic prosperity, while sort of the execution of the technical assistance with the community organizing would simultaneously build feelings of community and a common sense that the village together could in fact initiate, sustain, and improve their own lives. So to the Middle East case. So after the first Arab-Israeli War in 1948, the United Nations asked the Service Committee to aid Palestinian refugees. So the Service Committee aided them in Gaza and then in Western Galilee. So leveraging their presence and international reputation, the AFSC's development work in the Middle East was centered in Israel and Jordan. After 48, Service Committee believed that settling the Palestinian refugee situation was the key to a peaceful settlement in the region. However, due to political stalemate, it was constrained in its ability to address the problem more directly. Accordingly, they had two goals for their work in the region. One was to encourage Jewish-Arab reconciliation through contact and relationship building. And the second goal preceded the first. Arabs had to be, quote unquote, developed to both help them survive and place them on equal footing with Jews. Reflecting common sort of Western assumptions about the supposed dependence and fatalism of rural areas, integration was central to their work with Arabs in Israel. Viewing Israel as a modern state, they believed that the Arabs could be made into productive and contributing members. The Israeli government would come to accept them as equal citizens. And sort of the goodwill that this would generate would in turn convince Arab states to help resettle Palestinian refugees and thereby easing tensions throughout the region. So the Service Committee's community development efforts were primarily aimed at sort of the second goal, to sort of promote development amongst the Arabs. And so I explore here three of their community development projects in Israel and Jordan. And so I'll first sort of just very briefly detail them, and then I'll come back to a more general discussion of the community development aspects. So one of the first projects was an agricultural modernization project in the Arab village of Tehran in Galilee. The Tehran project involved sending agricultural specialists to demonstrate the value of machinery, improve seeds, and the use of fertilizer. It also included a health program for women and children, training programs for agricultural machinery, and eventually they hoped to organize efforts to get the village to establish a cooperative to manage the agricultural machinery. The second project was a community center in the mixed but segregated town of Acre, just north of Haifa. The community center had two sequential goals. First, like Tehran, the community center would provide activities designed to bring Arabs, quote unquote, up to the modern standards of Israeli Jews. These activities encompassed, activities for all ages and included vocational training, health instruction, film nights, the establishment of a library, and recreation. The second goal was to incorporate Jews into the center's activities. The third project, sort of seeking to balance out its efforts in Israel with work in an Arab country so they weren't seen as sort of favoring Israel over the other Arab states. The Service Committee took up a project in Jordan in 5 remote villages northeast of Amman. So the approach was holistic, comprising agricultural, health, housing, education, teacher training, and cooperative credit societies. It was ultimately hoped that the project could serve as an example, as with the case with the Israeli government, spurring and showing how the Jordanian government could connect with its rural areas, and eventually to the Palestinian refugees within Jordan. So now sort of coming back to a dedicated discussion. So if technical assistance and community organizing were interwoven, relationship building was sort of part of the glue that bound them together. And so as noted, the Service Committee especially prioritized the role of relationship building within their own community development programs. Relationship building demonstrated a respect for and willingness to work with and through local ways and institutions. This built trust and was to ensure appropriateness. Thus, across their program, Service Committee personnel lived where they worked. They frequently made home visits to build relationships and discover local needs. They trained and used locals as field staff, and they encouraged cooperation with the ministries of the Israeli and Jordanian governments wherever possible. But I want to more specifically focus on sort of 3 examples of sort of this weaving together of social and economic change through relationship building for peace and prosperity. The community center is one example. The community center was sort of the centerpiece of the Service Committee's work in Acre. It was through the center that the Service Committee brought together the Arab community for a host of programming, as well as economic improvement as sort of the first step in enabling better, more equal relationships between Arabs and Jews. Although eventually stymied by the Israeli government, the Service Committee had hoped to eventually bring in Jewish members, thereby building community across cultural and religious divides. So another example is the establishment of village committees. Excuse me. In Tehran, the Service Committee and Israeli government representatives met with the village heads, or the Mukhtars, to explain the project. Tentative, the Mukhtars agreed. Then the Service Committee's agricultural specialists began work by forming a village committee among the village leaders, and similar processes guided their work in the Jordanian villages. But the village committees were mechanisms for not only building relationships between the Service Committee and the community, but also amongst the community leaders themselves, so it was hoped. So from this base of cooperation, economic and social development could be advanced. The village committee was supposed to both provide local input on opportunities to increase incomes, to sort of the economic side, and given their stature within the community, they were to be a locus for galvanizing cooperative action, being channels for the promotion of village responsibility and initiative for any projects. A third example is the rural cooperative. In Tehran, the Service Committee hired a community organizer who sought to organize the villagers as a community and ready them to take responsibility for agricultural equipment through the creation of a cooperative. But especially in Jordan, the Service Committee would make the formation of credit cooperatives a priority. And so the cooperative was a technical assistance strategy that reaped social as well as economic benefits. On the economic side, cooperatives were a way to reach farmers within the village and provide a self-help means toward economic security and self-sufficiency. One Service Committee official noted it was by, quote, encouraging them to provide for themselves through cooperative organization that new attitudes towards self-help efforts and toward adopting innovations can be generated. Thus, cooperatives were a common rural scheme to consolidate economic leverage to improve incomes and standards of living, but economic cooperation would lead to social cooperation. Reflecting common American assumptions about rural Arabs, the Service Committee believed cooperatives could address what they saw as social deficiencies common to Arab villages. One official noted, quote, self-help cooperative societies can and do attack directly the roots of the complex of villager attitudes, including hopelessness regarding improvement of one's circumstances, a psychology of dependence on others, and feelings of distrust for persons outside the family and clan. In other words, cooperation for economic success would build constructive relationships and a greater sense of community. Accordingly, cooperatives, like village committees and community centers, were to be wedges for democratic sensibilities. One official noted, quote, economic security can provide the basis for democratic political development. The cooperative societies also aid this development by giving villagers experience in running democratic organizations and by providing them with a sense of participation and responsibility toward creating a better way of life for themselves and their fellows. So I now sort of turn to sort of the last section of the paper, offering a tentative assessment of sort of these approaches, highlighting sort of the limitations as well as sort of the promises. And so, as with many voluntary agencies of the era, the Service Committee took a non-proselytizing, neutral stance in its work. And indeed, as numerous scholars demonstrate, humanitarianism can never be fully separate from politics in many ways, even in the act of distributing food or building a school. And at the same time, staying neutral can be the only way to gain access to the people you try to help. So this tension was a difficult one, as the Service Committee's community development work acted in partnership with existing governments and established institutions, and thus had some difficulty more directly trying to confront structural or political issues. So in other words, this is sort of a refrain from the earlier panel too, to be able to stay and help people meant a certain amount of playing within the rules. So indeed, subscribing to a development philosophy that stressed the need to simultaneously encourage grassroots self-help and empowerment, as well as sort of building government capacity to connect with rural villages. So this was a continual roadblock. And indeed, sort of this desire to connect villages to the governments were primary causes for the ending of the Service Committee's programs in Israel and Jordan. Although the Service Committee often refused to accept government contracts, it did coordinate its technical assistance efforts with those of the U.S. government. U.S. aid officials commented quite often on the complementarity of the Service Committee's work with their own. But when nationalist tensions boiled over in Jordan and the Service Committee project there was destroyed in 1956, the Service Committee blamed ongoing U.S. support for Israel, as well as the commencement of a large-scale U.S. project. The Service Committee field director argued that, quote, "It has been impossible to separate our project from the U.S. government in the minds of the people." Furthermore, the Service Committee's adherence to the community development philosophy seemed to cause them to underestimate or unintentionally sideline the feelings of isolation, exclusion, and bitterness of Palestinians towards the Israeli government. This was the case despite the fact that the Israeli government maintained constant vigilance and occasionally even obstructed Service Committee initiatives. The Service Committee often commented on how the government had, quote, "a finger in every pie." And in 1956, the entire AFSC unit in Israel discussed whether or not they should withdraw altogether, given the government's constraints on their work. By 1960, the Service Committee even wondered if its presence among Arabs was now a hindrance to their self-help and economic integration by isolating Arabs from Israeli government services. But the Service Committee persisted in trying to integrate Palestinian Arabs. They feared the jeopardization of their work on one hand, but I think believed with well-intentioned sincerity on the other that by promoting equality, they could in fact prove to Zionist officials that Arabs could be a productive, beneficial component of Israeli society. So this is why examples of Arab reluctance on these projects are particularly notable. When the Service Committee ended the Turan agricultural project in '55, it had failed to cultivate a cooperative. So it sold its machinery to the Israeli Ministry of Agriculture. They hoped that the act of leaving would spur the village to act, but the Arab distrust of the government was represented in the quote-unquote hard feelings felt by the village when the Service Committee informed them of the sale. In another example, the decision to move ahead with integrating the Acre Community Center, so that is to sort of include Jewish members, this move was met with disapproval from the Arab community leaders. The AFSC staff suspected that the Arabs' negative feelings stemmed from a fear that, quote, eventually their center would be taken over by the Jews and the government. So just by way of brief conclusion, I think there are important lessons from sort of these sorts of historical overviews of a community development approach to peace building from the bottom up. But it should not take away from the Service Committee's role in seeking to address the plight of Palestinian Arabs in a peaceful and humane manner. And indeed, I think it's notable that the greatest strides were made through the push for human relationships. On nearly every project, the Service Committee reported on sort of the building of warm, personable relationships with the Arabs. And in and of itself, this is no small feat. Moreover, I think sort of a development emphasis on sort of catalytic agents, and the little things, emphasizing partnerships and relationship building, is a more humane approach for American interactions in the world than cookie-cutter, sort of strictly economic development models, lack of grassroots input, and top-down change by fiat. So, thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Pedro Rios. I'm the director of the U.S.-Mexico Border Program based out of San Diego, and it's my pleasure this morning to offer some reflection on the three papers that were provided to me and that were discussed this morning. So thank you to all three panelists, and thank you to all of you who are here this morning. I'd like to begin by first suggesting that what I'm going to say, I'm essentially placing it within the context of the community organizing work that comes out of San Diego. And I've been employed with AFSC now for 14 years, and the model that we use is one that to some extent has been reflected in the papers that were presented this morning. Primarily this idea or notion of a two-pronged approach. So I sincerely do appreciate the panel this morning. If you were here earlier during the morning, the panel was based on service provision, and what I see as being an important component, if not an integral component, to how community-based organizing happens, how grassroots organizing happens, I think throughout the history of the AFSC's work, not only domestically, but also internationally. And with that, the two components that I would say are part of this approach are, one, the provision of services, or what I would call humanitarian aid, providing humanitarian aid, however that might look. And I know that it's reflected in different ways in the papers that were discussed. And then the grassroots leadership, so supporting what could be holistic work coming out of those communities. And so certainly I'm wondering, for instance, if in my specific case, being from the border and doing the border organizing work, if perhaps I could be situated in a similar context as the protagonists that were highlighted or that inferred to in the paper. So for instance, in Terrence's papers, the people that were working on the ground, Mr. McCain and Mr. Solomon, were certainly people that came from that community, people that knew that community well, had already developed a trusting relationship because they were from that community. And then also the attempts in the work that Stephen talked about, which was working with organizations that were deeply entrenched in the issues of the LGBTQ community and lifting up the concerns that they were working on during the period of time that he described. And then finally with Palestinian Arabs and trying to inculcate, I think, the notion of hiring or working with community organizers that were already members of that community. And so it's kind of interesting for me to make that reflection because it's essentially very similar to how we do our work in Centennial. One just brief example of that is our work with farm workers, where perhaps one of the ways that we develop a trusting relationship with that community is by having hired people who speak Mixteco or Triqui or Amuzco so that they're able to communicate more directly with that impacted and affected community. And then in that way, we're able to decipher what the needs are and then subsequently respond to those needs, but at the same time, offering opportunities for community organizing. For instance, by ensuring that those members of that specific community are involved in organizing campaigns, not only within their specific and immediate community, but also with members of other communities in the greater San Diego region. So I think in the case of the Palestinian Arabs, the notion of little things, you know, being concerned with little things was something that certainly did resonate with me. Addressing issues of education, addressing issues of health, addressing issues of providing agricultural technique, for instance, is one way to certainly gain the trust, because essentially what community organizers do at that point would be, and in this case the American Friends Service Committee, would be to try to address the immediate needs of that community, but at the same time that perhaps might lead towards the idea of creating a community center where those community members would be defining for themselves in this idea of the self-help, which what I would describe as a self-determination, which is a language that comes out of the work out of San Diego. And very similar in that sense that it's the affected community itself that highlights and identifies the problems in that community, and then subsequently also develops the solutions for that specific community. In Francis's paper, he does discuss some interesting and intriguing obstacles, and I think primarily issues of trust and perhaps a context that I'm not fully completely aware of, but certainly that are implied, trusting an institution or an organization that is US-based and having placed within the context of what was going on with the Israeli state at that particular point in time. With the case of the African American organizers out of the South, what was particularly interesting to me was the analysis that I think it was McCain, when he was working with the Palmetto Teachers Association, that he already was bringing in a gendered and a class and a race analysis as well. And so one question that I would propose, or that I would ask myself, is to what extent would the American Friends Service Committee, for instance, also respond to an analysis that was already being put forward by the organizers that were working on behalf and that were working as liaisons with that impacted community. So that's another, I think, interesting feature of the papers themselves in trying to interrogate, as we do within community organizing these days, where we are much more purposeful about highlighting our intersectional connections. In this case, it seems to me that there were some opportunities in the three papers. For instance, in Stephen's paper, it was quite clear that the LGBT community from early on was involved not only in anti-war and anti-imperialist work, but also very purposeful reaching out to communities of color, and as well as addressing class issues. And I think what was intriguing for me and how it connected to AFSC's work is that there was sort of this internal, external struggle within AFSC, so that AFSC's early involvement in breakthrough analysis and acknowledgement of the complexities of non-binary sexuality. And so that to me was really important, because I think it does spell out to some extent the degree that AFSC was not only responding to the community's needs and calls for change, but also internally. And as Stephen pointed out, there have been some advances internally. And I think at some point AFSC in 2005, correct me if I'm wrong, Stephen, AFSC developed a plan that could be shared with other organizations in terms of how to develop healthcare policies that respond to new vantage points for addressing healthcare needs. Within, I think, with the Orangeburg Freedom Movement, you know, as I mentioned, the race and gendered analysis was there, which was responding to a very aggressive white supremacist movement through these white citizen councils that were determined to impact people's lives to the extent where one of the cases that Terence did not highlight when he spoke, but that is in his paper, is how a family who depended on the delivery of milk for their child, who I believe was afflicted with hemophilia, you know, that family now had to respond to a unique and dangerous situation where their child no longer had access to the protein that they needed to have. And so AFSC's involvement in that specific case, and in other cases, placed a counterweight to the white supremacist ideals that were being presented by some of these organizations that were in power. And then also in Francis's case, he did also present, I think, a race and a class analysis, primarily between the relationship of the Palestinian Arabs together with the state of Israel. And I think that, I think if I had any critique amongst the papers, would be how we might explore that intersection a little bit more, how we might tease out what the relationship buildings might have been if we were to place it within a much more contemporary context where the notion of intersectionality, especially as the movement for Black Lives has challenged us in a way, and even to a greater extent, or to, not a greater extent, to a more recent extent, LGBTQ youth who are involved in the immigrant rights movement, who also have been challenging the immigrant rights movement to have a clearer picture about our analysis when we define our work, and oftentimes doesn't include all the voices that it should. So I don't want to take too much time. I do, I think we want to have time for some Q&A. So why don't we do that, and we'll have our panelists respond to questions that you might have.
Yes. The news media. The news media is supposed to give equal time on all issues. And you see Matt Lauer, George Stephan.
My only thoughts is, one of my thoughts is I have a student who has decided, and I don't know how far we'll get with this, but he's decided that he's going to try to create a program to address, for example, African American issues in a way that generally they're not addressed by the media, for example. And what his idea is he wants to stay away from the same stuff we get from the media every single day. Because he wants to, because he thinks that there's a lot of nuances that, like, and that's a very good example of there's people who engage in peace, people who talk peace. Well, that doesn't make a good story. What makes a good story is when people, you know, if I get up in a hateful situation, then the cameras would certainly turn on me, and I would be a major story. So that's it'll be interesting in how he's going to work on that. As creating a media, because not wait, in other words, the whole idea of a grassroots is, well, I'm not going to wait for them to do something that they just haven't done before. Not saying you shouldn't have people who are pacifists who try to get on the air, but there might also be options where you say, well, let's create an alternative media.
I have a question for Francis, which is, I'm really loud. I don't think I need this. So I have a question for Francis. I think that one of the questions that strikes me while you're reading your paper is, what's the connection between, you know, this is 1950s, right? So what's the connection between the direction that development work, not just with the AFSC, but more generally development work goes. You know, in 10 years we have the Peace Corps, things like that. So I don't know how far your work goes, but you know, what connections do you see between what the AFSC is doing at this point and what comes a decade later?
Yeah. So the it all gets really complicated by the late 50s and by the 60s with the incoming JFK administration. I don't quite go that far, but I think I can gesture towards an answer. So the community development was really popular across the 1950s, and it sort of remained active primarily amongst sort of American religiously affiliated groups like the Service Committee, so throughout. And then even I think, I'm not sure I can draw a direct connection, but sort of empowerment strategies today I think can sort of be linked back in sort of ways to this earlier set of practices. But I think sort of the community development approach, it sort of failed to deliver on its promise. And I mean, the UN was doing it, the US government was doing it in countries around the world. And so it wasn't, in sort of the Cold War context, it wasn't happening fast enough, which community development is a long-term process. But within the Cold War context, people felt that it wasn't doing enough fast enough. And so sort of modernization theory really comes to the fore by the 60s. And modernization theory sort of, you know, was more dominated by sort of an urban industrial consumerist vision for what society should look like, whereas community development was a little more agriculturally rooted. And so you see, but even within modernization projects, particularly in Vietnam, you still see sort of the influence of community development. So in projects like the Strategic Hamlet project in Vietnam, sort of the forced, how to put it, sort of forcing Vietnamese peasants into sort of guarded areas, you know, sort of a very top-down way of doing it, but then they would use voluntary organizations to provide sort of community development services within these modernization projects. So, so community development lived on and sort of intersected in very interesting ways with sort of modernization theory.
Great, thank you. Sonia?
Can I hold it? So, Francis, thank you for your paper. As somebody who worked on Middle East issues and worked on Palestine for quite some time, I was really surprised to learn that when AFSC left the village, that we sold our agricultural equipment to the Israeli government. Wow. So I'm wondering if you could tell us in your research if there was any logic or any of the rationale presented for that, why we might not just have left it for the villagers.
Right. It's a good question. So the goal, the goal was to create a cooperative. So while they were there, they tried to sort of organize the village to take over the machinery on their own. But it didn't happen. And so the service committee felt that their continuing to operate the machinery was essentially, they felt that it was, they were running a business rather than trying to promote a cooperative. And so they worried that if they left the machinery, it wouldn't serve the purpose of establishing a cooperative and promoting community organization. And at the same time, sort of within the community development approach, they were generally trying to get the Israeli government to recognize and respond to the needs of Arab villagers. And so I think they had an ambiguous relationship with Israeli officials. So on the one hand, you sort of had the higher echelon, which really sort of saw Arabs as a nuisance, you know, at worst sort of a fifth column for other Arab countries. But then you had sort of lower level officials who actually worked, you know, they were in sort of community education, social welfare departments, who, at least as the service committee reported, had more genuine interest in the welfare of the Arabs. And so I think part of their thinking was within sort of the community development approach to, to sell the machinery to the Israeli Ministry of Agriculture was on the agreement that the department would then use that machinery cooperatively in other Arab villages. And so that was their rationale.
Question back here.
Thank you for the three panelists, and I'd like to make a comment and maybe ask you for some personal reflections. It has been very interesting for us to watch the development in the field of third parties going into a cultural context that is very different than their own, and how with more reflection and more actually academic research, how they themselves have been transformed with the interaction in the communities that they are working in. From either of the panelists or all three, if we can have just maybe one or two reflections from your own transformation by working in communities that were different than your own.
Who would like to start?
I can start. Even though I'm a Southerner, South Carolina was different from my experience. My experience, I'm a Southerner from Florida, but South Carolina, particularly Columbia, South Carolina, was different from my experiences in Florida. I found that it was much more Christian, much more conservative. I come from a background that's not conservative, and conservative in thinking outside of the box, as opposed to, and not think so. So I had to work with people who, I had to be very respectful of their the very conservative Christian religious beliefs and attitudes, what I got from South Carolina that was very positive was that, and I think that this is something that I would like to see more in America, particularly with people who are considering themselves progressives and who want to make positive change in society, is I found that, South Carolina has a long history of oppression, particularly African Americans. And what I came away with just working, because I worked in a lot of different churches, with a lot of different other black organizations, helping them film their history, for example. And what I learned is that they seem, in spite of all that oppression, to let go of fear, hate, and anger. And I kind of think this is why, for example, the Orangeburg freedom movement was so successful. It's because they didn't become the thing that they hated. You see what I'm saying? There was hate, but what they did was when they marched and they protested, they didn't use all kinds of hateful words and things of this sort of nature. And so that's what I got from it. And I think that that's something that those of us who want to progress and push our particular issues of what we think is right, we need to not be so fearful of the future, so.
Stephen?
So I think that the Service Committee's engagement with LGBT individuals and communities has been, as he says, sort of a two-way street in the sense of a lot of times the cultural aspects of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people are very, very different than the usual mainstream AFSC Quaker culture. I can think of one instance, Tom Bodine, who worked with the Japanese American camps, had a wicked sense of humor. And it struck people as very odd, and eventually he came out. And so humor is one of the aspects that minority communities use to deal with their sense of oppression and lack of acceptance. So I think that the idea that a mainstream, somewhat mainstream faith group wants to engage and help support and work with an oppressed minority means there's a level of acceptance that is very positive for the LGBT community in terms of AFSC's involvement. So I think there's a little bit of interaction that changes each of the groups.
So I don't have an activist background, or I haven't done. I don't have an activist background. And I haven't done ethnographic work, so I can't speak to personal experience with that question. But I would think that to go into a different community so different from yours would require a great deal of humility and self-reflexivity about your own historical, cultural location, and to be sensitive to theirs as well. It might also require a sense of processes being maybe more important than certain outcomes, sort of the process of being with others in certain circumstances. I know for the service committee in the Middle East, I know it was tough for them, sort of the community development approach advocated sort of a self-reflexivity, a trying to work within local institutions. And it was difficult in the sense that they were recruiting technicians, so people with expertise who had day jobs in the United States, who they would recruit for usually 2-year periods as volunteers to go and do the work. But this often meant that, you know, they didn't have the cultural knowledge of where they were going. They didn't speak Arabic. And so they sort of had to, they would get a little bit of training, but the urgency to get technicians out in the field was so urgent that it was pretty preliminary. So they had to do a lot of learning on the fly. So in that sense, it was a struggle.
Another question down here.
This is another question for Francis, but I think it speaks to all sorts of grassroots organizing. You mentioned that there was the sense within the service committee that their involvement could be potentially harmful for their own like grassroots organizing, and I was wondering if you could touch more on that.
So in the sense that I mentioned that by 1960, they had thought of their presence as maybe a hindrance to their work. And so they were thinking along the lines of, you know, sort of integrating Arabs into Israeli society and the Israeli economy. And so they were under sort of financial constraints by the late 50s, and so they were looking for ways forward or ways out, ways to move on. And so they felt that perhaps by continuing to work with Arabs, they were sort of almost counterintuitively preventing Arabs from connecting to the Israeli government. So by their providing services for the Arabs, it meant that the Israeli government didn't have to. And so for them, they felt this was a detriment to the social and economic survival of Arabs in Israel. I don't know if that answers your... Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
I was raised in Lancaster County, which is over to the west along the Susquehanna River, and I live out in the country there, and I'm back there now. I don't fit anymore. You don't leave a place like that and go back and fit in. I've been heavily involved in all kinds of things with the black community all my life, and I just don't, I'm listening to what you say about modernization and the government, and in Lancaster County, I don't really know how to get a handle on how I would. It's extremely conservative. The Ku Klux Klan is still there. The Grand Master lives a little bit south of me. The Aryan Nation. I mean, it's tough to get a handle on what the zeitgeist is and the consciousness, because it's all Trump, and it's all like, leave us alone. We want things the way they used to be. If new people want to come in here, let them get a job and buy property and buy their own health insurance. We don't want to help them. Let them help themselves. And it's tough to organize a community like that.
In the last minute that we have, any final thoughts or response?
Oh, you want us to comment on that?
If you want, if you like, if not,
oh, okay.
We can close it out.
Well, I put it in the context of this, when people are, you know, today who have all kinds of fears, and they seem to think that things, I get the impression they think that things need to change, need to happen quick. And and I put it in the context of African history, African American history. You have more than 150 years where African Americans fought for the right to vote, the right to be real citizens, the right not to be killed, and we're still fighting for those rights. Unfortunately, the struggle for justice is often unpleasant for the people who are the ones who step forward and try to do it. It's no way. It's not going to be easy. My research shows that some people died, some people, family went insane. I've talked to people like that. Some people died of mysterious circumstances, and nobody knows where what happened. A lot of people lost their jobs. But I'm saying that in the end, it got better for future generations, and I think that that's what has to happen. But I think that the grassroots organization would make the difference. Because if you're in your community, this is what's happening. I think that you might have to look outside of your community for other groups that organize, and they may be able to help you in ways that you maybe within that group you can't help yourself. But it's something that has to, like all the hate that you're suggesting is in your community. It seems like it. And also, I think that a lot of people in America, on all sides, because I teach school, I find that, a lot of our young people, they don't know anything about the past. Or if they do, they know very superficial things about it. And I think that one of our jobs that we have to do is somehow make sure that they don't go through life not knowing about other people and other people's struggle. So that's my take on it.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Please help me thank the panelists.
Okay.